Adding smear frames to your animation skill tree will allow you to create faster and punchier motion than otherwise possible. If you want to animate action of any sort, it'll really benefit you to learn how. You may already know what they are, but in case you don't, smear frames mimic the effect of how cameras and our eyes pick up fast motion. Quick movement caught by a camera will usually have a motion blur, and if you move your hand very fast back and forth right now, you might start to see it seem to duplicate. These same things can be created in animation with distortion. If you're drawing a frame in an animation where a very fast action is in progress, distorting the moving object can create this same visual effect. There are a lot of ways you can draw this distortion, but I think the easiest and most common to use is wobbling your lines. Here's a circle, and here is the same circle, but moving fast. The direction you draw these squiggles indicates the direction that the object is moving. So by looking at this, we know the circle is either moving this way or this way. Increasing the intensity of your line waves indicates faster speed. Now this circle is moving really fast. You might also want to draw some speed lines around the edges of the shape, again going in the direction that the object is moving. Everything should be parallel. If your squiggles and lines are going in different directions, even just a little, the illusion of speed and clearness of the action won't get across. You also want to use randomness in your lines. The squiggles you draw should vary in size and spacing, and so should action lines. The alternative, making them evenly spaced and sized, doesn't look natural at all. The typical way you would animate a movement is with slow in, slow out, aka starting the movement slowly, picking up speed, and then slowing back down at the end of it. But when using smear frames, you can go about things a bit differently. Take a look at this animation study I did from Pokemon. I colored these frames based on the level of action lines and smearing they have, red having the most action and smearing. We start with slower movement where the drawings aren't too far apart. Then it suddenly snaps into a less closely connected pose with intense wobbling and action lines. Then we slow back down for a bit, but after that is another intense jump from the previous frame. Here's what this looks like with the circle. These first frames we can call the prep frames because it's what happens before the big action. Think of a cat getting ready to pounce or someone winding back before they throw a punch. The movement can go in the same direction as the big action or in the opposite direction like a spring. These frames are all pretty close together and have little to no distortion on them. Then comes the big action. Like in the Pokemon animation, this frame can seem like a big jump forward. In this case, the circle has suddenly gotten much farther ahead. Creating this sudden departure from your previous frame might seem wrong, but it'll give your action a really strong punchiness. Usually these intense smears only last about 1 to 3 frames, and if you're a beginner, I think just having one of these frames is best since it's much easier to pull off. After this big action smear frame, you have the option to slow out of the motion more gradually than you let into it. These frames may have very subtle smearing, but nothing crazy. There's a good chance that when you play the animation, it won't look quite right yet. In my case, I found that the difference in speed of the smear frame versus the beginning and end of the animation wasn't different enough for how dramatic I made the smear frame. To fix this, I pretty much just needed to make the spacing gaps around the smear frame bigger compared to the tighter spacing before and after. Here's the final result. Again, you can see how slowly and gradually transitioning into the big action isn't needed. And by comparison, if you do use normal slow in at the start, it doesn't have quite the same impact. It's a common beginner animator struggle to want to fill in all of the gaps and draw in every moment of an action, but sometimes large gaps are necessary and result in better animation. For your smear frames to look believable, you need to understand how arcs and paths work in animation. When animating any sort of action, with or without smear frames, you should be able to draw a line that is a path for the object to follow. This path could be a straight line, like it might be for a stiff, strong punch. It could also be a C-curve, and most actions are a curve. Instead of this cat's head snapping straight back, it goes in a natural curve upward. Any other path is going to be a more elaborate form of these, like an S-curve that a flying creature might travel in. Knowing where the path is that your action is traveling on will tell you where your smear frames should go. It doesn't matter how distorted your smearing is, if it breaks out of the path, it's going to look janky. I recommend drawing borders on a different layer that'll tell you the exact space that the object will occupy as it moves. Then you can draw your smears within this boundary and you won't have a problem. There are lots of other ways to draw smear frames, and you can pick whichever feels best for your style or the specific action. Duplication is another common way to distort your object, and this effect can be quite fun to draw. For just one quick frame, I can give this cat multiple sets of eyes, ears, and other facial features, once again following a clean curve. It's as if you're seeing multiple frames at the same time. It might take some trial and error before you get the effect you want, but that's normal. Trying things and seeing how it looks in action is part of the fun. Last of all, let's talk about the simplification that you can do with smear frames. Sometimes your smear is so intense that it's hard to include all of the detail in the thing that is moving. Luckily though, you don't have to worry too much about all that detail. To prove it, here's the most extreme simplification that you can possibly do in a smear frame. Pausing on the smear, it's just a simple blob following the arc of the motion. You don't have to go quite this simple, but the option is there. Even the color is stripped down to just the single most prevalent color on the character. And not just the smear frame, but this action as a whole is very simplified. All it is 3 frames. The starting pose, the smear, and the ending pose. Although pretty crude, you can get away with this sometimes as a shortcut alternative to animating more complicated movement, especially when animating comedy that isn't meant to be taken too seriously. It really demonstrates how important arcs are for animating action. For a simple, curving shape to be all that's really necessary to make something move from one spot to another. Here's some more animation tutorials I've made. Thanks for watching!